What if one missing person investigation uncovered one of the darkest secrets in American criminal history? Imagine driving down a quiet coastal highway late at night. To your left, the Atlantic Ocean stretches endlessly into darkness. To your right, miles of thick brush and empty marshland disappear into the shadows. It's silent, almost peaceful. But beneath that silence, a horrifying secret remained hidden for years. In December 2010, a police officer and his K-9 partner searched this very stretch of Long Island shoreline, looking for a missing woman. They weren't searching for a serial killer. They weren't expecting to uncover a crime scene. But within minutes, the dog stopped. Hidden beneath the brush were human remains. Then another discovery followed, and another, and another. What investigators believed was a routine search suddenly became one of the largest serial murder investigations in New York history. For years, families had searched desperately for answers. Now detectives were asking a terrifying question. How many victims had been hidden here? And who was responsible? This is the story of the Gilgo Beach investigation, a case filled with mystery, years of unanswered questions, and an investigation that would eventually take more than a decade to produce a major arrest. But even today, the full story may still not be known. To understand how this investigation began, we have to go back to the spring of 2010. 24-year-old Shannon Gilbert traveled to Oak Beach, a gated community on Long Island's South Shore. Like many nights before, she had arranged to meet a client. Nothing about the evening suggested it would become one of the most discussed disappearances in America. Just before dawn, everything changed. At approximately 4:51 in the morning, Shannon called 911. The call lasted more than 20 minutes. According to investigators, she repeatedly said that someone was trying to kill her. The conversation was confusing, at times frantic, and at times difficult to understand. After leaving the residence, she ran through the quiet neighborhood, knocking on doors and asking for help. Several residents later reported seeing her. One homeowner said she appeared frightened and refused offers to call the police. Another witness reported seeing her running into the darkness. And then, she disappeared. As the sun rose over Oak Beach, there was no trace of her. Family members pleaded for answers. Friends organized searches. Police began combing through the surrounding marshland. But despite helicopters, officers, and search teams, nothing was found. Weeks turned into months. The investigation seemed to have reached a dead end. No one realized that the search for one missing woman was about to expose something far more disturbing. 7 months later, on December 11th, 2010, Officer John Malia and his specially trained police dog returned to search the area near Ocean Parkway. Suddenly, the dog changed direction. It pushed through thick brush just off the highway and then stopped. The officer immediately knew something wasn't right. Hidden beneath the vegetation, he found skeletal human remains. The search area was quickly secured. Investigators arrived expecting they had finally located Shannon Gilbert. But forensic examination quickly revealed something shocking. The remains belonged to someone else. The victim was later identified as Melissa Barthelemy, who had disappeared in 2009. Detectives were stunned. How had another missing woman ended up here? They expanded the search. Within days, another body was discovered. Then another. Then another. 4 women had been found along the same isolated stretch of Ocean Parkway. Each discovery raised even more questions. Were these random victims? Or had investigators stumbled onto the work of a serial killer? The 4 women would later become known as the Gilgo Beach 4. Each had disappeared years apart. Each had worked as an escort at some point in her life. Each had vanished after arranging meetings with clients. And each had been left in the same remote area. The similarities were impossible to ignore. For detectives, this was no longer simply a missing persons investigation. It had become a homicide investigation unlike anything Suffolk County had ever faced. Behind every headline and every breaking news report were real people. Each victim had dreams, families, and friends who never stopped searching for them. Melissa Barthelemy disappeared in July 2009 after traveling to meet a client in New York City. When she failed to return home, her family immediately reported her missing. Then something unimaginable happened. Weeks after her disappearance, Melissa's younger sister began receiving disturbing phone calls. The caller was using Melissa's cell phone. He mocked the family, insulted them, and even suggested that Melissa was already dead. The calls lasted only a few minutes each. Investigators later determined they had been made from crowded public locations across New York City, making it nearly impossible to identify the caller. Another victim, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, disappeared in 2007 after traveling from Connecticut to New York for work. Her family searched relentlessly, but years passed with no answers. Megan Waterman vanished in 2010 after leaving a hotel in Hopaug, New York. She was only 22 years old. Amber Lynn Costello disappeared just months later after leaving her home to meet someone she believed was a client. Friends later told investigators they had seen a man driving a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche around the neighborhood shortly before she vanished. At the time, it seemed like a small detail. Years later, it would become one of the investigation's most significant leads. As investigators searched further along Ocean Parkway in early 2011, they made even more discoveries. Additional human remains were recovered in nearby areas. Some belonged to previously unidentified victims, while others were later linked to missing persons cases dating back many years. The discoveries fueled speculation. Were all of these victims connected? Had one killer used the area repeatedly? Or had multiple offenders chosen the same isolated location to conceal their crimes? Investigators carefully examined every possibility. The dense vegetation, limited lighting, and low nighttime traffic made Ocean Parkway an area where someone familiar with Long Island could move without attracting much attention. But despite extensive searches and hundreds of interviews, detectives struggled to identify a suspect. The investigation generated national attention. Television networks covered every development. Crime analysts debated possible offender profiles. Families continued hoping that each new discovery would bring answers. Instead, the case seemed to grow more complicated. Years passed. Leads dried up. Public interest faded. To many people, the mystery of Gilgo Beach appeared destined to remain unsolved. But hidden among thousands of pages of reports, phone records, witness statements, and forensic evidence, one overlooked clue was waiting to change everything. And when investigators finally recognized its importance, the entire direction of the case would shift. For investigators, finding the bodies along Ocean Parkway was only the beginning. Identifying who was responsible would prove far more difficult. Detectives from the Suffolk County Police Department interviewed hundreds of witnesses. They reviewed missing person reports from multiple states, analyzed thousands of phone records, and followed countless tips from the public. But every promising lead ended the same way, with another dead end. Months turned into years. Then years became more than a decade. Families continued holding memorials while birthdays passed without answers. Hope slowly gave way to frustration, and many began to question whether the case would ever be solved. While public attention faded, the evidence remained, waiting. In 2022, authorities formed a multi-agency task force and decided to take another look at the entire investigation. Instead of assuming earlier conclusions were correct, investigators went back to the beginning. Every interview was reviewed again. Every witness statement was reread. Every phone record was examined using newer techniques and a sharper focus. Sometimes solving an old case doesn't require new evidence. It requires seeing the old evidence from a completely different perspective. One detail immediately caught their attention. Years earlier, a witness connected to the disappearance of Amber Lynn Costello had described seeing a first-generation Chevrolet Avalanche near her home shortly before she vanished. At the time, detectives had searched for thousands of similar vehicles. Now, with improved databases and a much narrower focus, they believed they could identify owners who matched other aspects of the case. One name stood out: Rex Hoyerman. He was an architect who lived in Massapequa Park on Long Island and worked in Manhattan. On the surface, nothing about his life seemed out of the ordinary. He owned an architecture firm, commuted to work every day, and appeared to lead a quiet suburban routine. But investigators believed his movements, phone records, and vehicle ownership were worth closer examination. From that point forward, surveillance began. Investigators watched quietly. They tracked his public movements, reviewed business records, and compared historical cell phone data with locations connected to the original investigation. According to prosecutors, several prepaid burner phones believed to have been used to contact victims showed patterns that aligned with places tied to Hoyerman's home and workplace. None of these pieces alone proved a crime, but taken together, prosecutors argued they formed part of a larger pattern. Detectives knew they still needed stronger forensic evidence before making an arrest. Then an unexpected opportunity appeared. While conducting surveillance, investigators collected items that Hoyerman had discarded in public. Those items were sent for laboratory testing. Prosecutors later said that DNA obtained from the discarded items was compared with biological evidence recovered from the Gilgo Beach scenes. Hair evidence found at some of the crime scenes was also reanalyzed using modern forensic techniques. According to prosecutors, some of those hairs were found to be consistent with DNA from members of Hoyerman's household. His defense has challenged aspects of the evidence, and the court would ultimately decide what weight it should carry. On July 13, 2023, investigators moved in. Rex Hoyerman was arrested in New York City. News of the arrest spread within hours. For many of the families, it was the first major breakthrough in more than a decade. Authorities charged him in connection with several of the Gilgo Beach killings. Over time, prosecutors expanded the charges to include additional victims. Following the arrest, search warrants were executed at his home, office, vehicles, and storage locations. Thousands of items were seized: computers, mobile phones, hard drives, documents, and digital media. Investigators spent months reviewing the material, and officials stated that the volume of evidence required an extensive forensic examination. The investigation, they said, was far from over. Even after the arrest, the mystery did not disappear. Investigators continued examining whether all of the remains discovered near Gilgo Beach were connected to a single offender. Some victims had been found years apart, while others were discovered in different conditions. Authorities kept investigating whether every case shared the same perpetrator or whether multiple crimes had intersected in the same area. For the families, those unanswered questions still mattered deeply. An arrest can provide hope, but only a completed investigation and the legal process that follows can bring final answers. As prosecutors prepared their case, investigators continued reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and testing additional material. Following the arrest, investigators faced an enormous amount of evidence to process: computers, mobile phones, digital storage devices, documents, photographs, and electronic records filled the case files. According to prosecutors, the investigation involved thousands of digital files and years of detailed forensic analysis. As more evidence was examined, prosecutors added further charges related to additional victims they allege are connected to the case. Rex Hoyerman ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple murders and was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His defense had challenged key parts of the prosecution's case, including aspects of the forensic evidence, but the legal process reached its conclusion in court. An arrest is never a conviction, and charges are never proof of guilt. The trial system exists to test the evidence presented by both sides. In this case, the court ultimately accepted the guilty plea, bringing the criminal proceedings to an end. Prosecutors had outlined several categories of evidence they said connected Hoyerman to the crimes. They pointed to cell phone records that they argued placed devices associated with him in locations relevant to the disappearances. They also presented witness statements, vehicle information, and forensic analysis of hair evidence recovered from the scenes. Investigators had examined internet activity and electronic devices seized during the searches. The defense disputed elements of this evidence and argued that the prosecution's conclusions required careful scrutiny. As in every criminal case, both sides had the opportunity to present experts, question witnesses, and challenge each other's interpretation of the facts. Advances in forensic science and digital investigation played a major role in reviving this cold case. Evidence that once seemed insignificant gained new importance when examined with improved technology. Amid all the discussions of evidence and court proceedings, it is important not to lose sight of the people at the center of this case. Melissa Barthelemy, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Megan Waterman, Amber Lynn Costello, and the other victims whose remains were found during the broader Gilgo Beach investigation were more than case files. They had families, friends, and dreams. They had people who searched for them and refused to stop asking questions. For years, many relatives feared they would never learn what had happened to their loved ones. While the investigation has provided some answers, the pain of those losses will never fully disappear. True crime stories often focus heavily on the offender, but the victims deserve to be remembered first. Even after years of investigation, Gilgo Beach continues to raise difficult questions. Were all of the victims discovered near Ocean Parkway killed by the same person? Could there be additional victims who have not yet been identified? Did earlier opportunities to connect the cases go unnoticed? Investigators have continued examining evidence in an effort to answer these questions. As technology advances and forensic methods improve, cold cases that once seemed impossible can sometimes move forward again. The story of Gilgo Beach is not simply the story of one man. It is a story about missing people whose disappearances were not immediately connected. It is a story about investigators who revisited old evidence with fresh eyes and new tools. It is a story about families who waited more than a decade for progress. And it is a reminder that justice can take an extraordinarily long time. For more than a decade, the dunes along Ocean Parkway concealed secrets that no one expected to uncover. What began as the search for one missing woman led investigators to one of the most significant homicide investigations in New York's history. The legal process has now concluded, but the impact of this case continues. It has already changed how many agencies approach cold cases, forensic evidence, and missing person investigations. Most importantly, the victims are not forgotten. Their names continue to be remembered, their families continue to seek truth, and investigators continue working to answer the questions that remain. If there is one lesson from this case, it is that even the smallest overlooked clue can one day become the key to unlocking a mystery that haunted investigators for years. Thank you for watching The Missing Report, USA. If you enjoy carefully researched true crime documentaries that focus on verified facts, major investigations, and the stories behind America's most significant cases, consider subscribing and turning on notifications.